Whoa! Oh my goodness! Today, I'm taking this truck and this intake manifold and I'm replacing those original crusty intake manifold gaskets with some nice, fresh, new ones. And this just may be why you should never attempt this job. Just wait, you'll see. And with that air box out of the way, we can see everything very clearly that we're going to need to remove. Things like all of the electrical connections, as well as any vacuum lines, and of course a lot of brackets and wires and the distributor, and all this stuff has to come out so we can pull that intake out. But before I do any of that, I'm gonna come over here to the battery and disconnect that negative battery cable. Disconnecting this negative side of the battery is very important because we will be dealing with fuel when we remove the fuel lines. The next thing I'm gonna do is drain this radiator. We need to get all this antifreeze out. One way to get that antifreeze to flow out quicker is to remove the cap. All right, with that coolant now slowed down to a drip, I'm gonna disconnect the upper radiator hose from the thermostat housing here. There we go. I'll disconnect this rear heater hose. Looking right back here behind this belt tensioner, you can see this brace bar that goes from the tensioner itself right on down to this intake manifold. So I'm gonna remove this brace and this other brace that you can barely see that goes from the back of this air conditioning compressor right on down to the middle of this intake manifold. All right, the bolts are out. Here comes the first bracket. And here is that second support brace. I'm now gonna go through and disconnect all of the electrical and vacuum lines. Okay, I've been at it for about an hour now, and you can see I have a lot of yellow tape on this harness. This entire harness is all of the electrical connections that were connected to different sensors and things. I've taped them all off. I've labeled where every single thing goes. I've taken pictures with my phone and I've set it off to the side. I've also removed the charge cable off of the rear of the alternator as well as a ground I had here. And you can see down here I removed this coolant hose coming off the top of the water pump. It's about time I removed the fuel lines, which are on the back of the throttle body. This is a 5/8 fitting. Oh my gosh, that was really, really loose. So that's weird. Okay, here's the other one. Wow, those were unbelievably loose. Oh my gosh. I mean, there is an O-ring on these things, so I guess as long as they're snug, they're fine, but... And there we go. That wasn't bad at all. And here is that throttle body removed. And if you're interested, I did a complete video on completely rebuilding this throttle body, including new injectors, all new seals, everything. I'll put the link to that video down in the description below. And here's the top of this intake manifold, right where that throttle body was attached. And thankfully, none of the gaskets stuck to the intake manifold, so it's gonna make my job a lot easier putting that thing back on. I've reached the point now where I have to start dealing with the distributor. This is the one thing that scared me a little bit. Although I know it's gonna be easy once I tackle it, get into it and all that, it's just a little bit scary because you have to make sure that the engine is at top dead center on cylinder number 1. You also need to know and label where all of the spark plug wires go onto the cap, which I have done. You can see the yellow tape back there. And once I take that cap off, I'm gonna have to mark the locations of the rotor, not only where it points when it is at top dead center on cylinder number 1, but also where it ends when I pull the distributor out of the block. So there's a couple of very, very important things that have to be done with that in order to be able to put it back together correctly. And that's what's giving me so much reserve when it comes to replacing these gaskets. Now quickly, paying attention to this lower intake manifold here, you can see just how grimy and oily and dirty it is. And I'm assuming that's partly because I probably have leaky valve cover gaskets, but also if you look down here at the front where the gasket maker is, it looks like it's leaking there as well. And so even though this vehicle only has about 89,000 original miles, it is from 1995. So those gaskets are definitely in need of replacement. I am really stoked that I'm finally doing this. I've been wanting to do this for years. And finally, I'm like, you know what? I just got to get in there and do it. Okay, before I go ahead and start tearing things apart, the first mark I want to make is down here on the very base of the distributor, where the distributor body actually meets the intake manifold, right here. Okay, I have these plug wires over here marked and already removed from the passenger side. So the plug wires on the driver's side are going to stay on the cap. That way when I take the cap off, I can just lay it off to the side. And that rotor very well might be pointing at top dead center on cylinder 1. So I'm gonna have to check that. Well, here is that number 1 spark plug, and you can see it actually doesn't look too bad. All right, I have a 5/8 on a 3/8 ratchet. I should have a longer ratchet than this, but this is what I'm using. So this is a spark plug socket, and I'm gonna put it on the bolt in the center of this crank pulley, which seems to be a perfect fit. Then I'm reaching for whatever reason, it's my ring finger. I'm poking it into the hole, the spark plug hole. I'm almost at top dead center here, and I want you to listen. You can hear air as I turn this. So this definitely is the compression stroke. Yep. And the other thing is, if we look down at the timing mark down there on that balancer, you can see that the line is right there, almost ready to be lined up with that first largest notch. Here is that top dead center mark, perfectly lined up at the 0. What might seem very simple to some of you is a little difficult for me because I've never been in this situation before. I just want to make 100% sure that this is top dead center, cylinder 1, on the compression stroke. And so far, based on the air escaping of spark plug hole number 1 and the timing mark being right there at 0 degrees and the rotor here pointing to where spark plug number 1 was attached to that cap, I'm pretty confident that top dead center, cylinder 1 on the compression stroke has been achieved. I've made a mark from the very tip of that rotor directly below it with a pencil, and I really do think I can pull that distributor now. Now I do have to also pay attention to that rotor as I pull it out. It's going to want to turn, and I need to mark that ending spot that the rotor stops as it turns while I'm pulling the distributor out, if that makes sense. The reason why I need to mark that mark as well is because that's where I'm going to put the rotor when I start to reinstall it, hoping that the tip of that rotor ends up on the mark that I just marked with a pencil. I've got this special tool I'm going to be using called a crowfoot in order to get that bolt off of the clamp that holds down the distributor. So I'll use my 6-inch extension, slide it right in there, and the tool is ready to go. And then I can just simply drop this down onto the bolt and it fits perfectly. Keeping pressure on the head of the ratchet, I'll go ahead and turn that, and there we go. Reposition, and that bolt is loose. So you can see there's a little notch in the actual body of the distributor. There's also a seam, a manufacturing seam right next to the notch that I made. And I put 2 marks on the actual aluminum intake manifold that correlate to both the seam of the distributor and the notch that I made. I also took a bunch of pictures at different angles just to see that they line up pretty much exactly, so that when I go to put this thing back together, I know where the distributor body needs to be located, also keeping into account the rotor tab and everything there. There goes the rotor rotating. Okay, I believe that was it. Well, here it is. I did my best to put my marks on the top. You can see hopefully you can see there's a mark there where it ended, where the rotor tip ended, and there's a mark there where it started life at top dead center. When I go to reinstall this thing, I'm going to be pushing it down into the hole with the rotor in the ending position, hoping that it grabs onto these curved gears, you can see, and it's going to hopefully land where we started while it was in on top dead center. That is why it is so incredibly important to make sure you do all these things and not just go ripping stuff apart. You really have to have a really good understanding of what this process is and how to do this before you go taking this apart. With everything now moved out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and take my vacuum and just vacuum out all of the larger debris that's sitting along the valleys here. I don't want to go removing this intake manifold and have a bunch of dirt and debris fall into the engine area. First bolt, let's see. There we go. That sucker was tight. And here's another one. I'm kind of going around to all the corners first. Just breaking them loose. Seems like just putting a lot of pressure on this thing is what did the trick. So let me come to the other side here. There we go. Yes. All right, it released. Wow. These gaskets are obviously kind of attached to the block and attached to the manifold, so that's what's going to really be causing this to not just come off easy. Yeah, I can see it. We got a fuel line kind of sort of in the way. Yep, there we go. Well, there she is, one small block Chevy, throttle body injected, lower intake manifold, and we are going to get this thing cleaned up. Let's look back in the engine compartment and see what that looks like. Oh wow, that's really not bad. I told you guys this thing only has 89,000 original miles on it, and that is the proof right there. No sludge, no muck, no buildup. This is going to be pretty easy for me to clean out. Oh yeah, look at that. Whoa! Oh my goodness! Look at that! Oh my gosh! Wow! Well, I'm not gonna lie, I've been at this for days now. I think this is my third day, and what I've been doing all that time is scraping gasket material off of not only the steel or iron heads, whatever they are, but also off of the aluminum intake manifold. Here in the engine compartment, you can see the heads are completely scraped clean. Everything is scraped completely clean. I just have to wipe it down, and then this side is good to go. A couple of areas like this rear port back here, you can see a little bit of pitting there. I may put some extra RTV around that area, but overall I feel like this is in really good shape. I'll tell you what, it was taking so long to scrape those gaskets. I ended up picking up this tool. This is the first time I've ever owned one of these, and boy oh boy did it work out. This thing is a rock star when it comes to removing gasket material, but that is only on the side of the heads. On the aluminum side, I did use this, but I had to be extremely careful because the aluminum is much softer metal. I also used this razor blade scraper as well. This came in handy on the heads, not so handy on the aluminum intake. Taking a look at the bottom of the manifold, you can see it is pretty darn clean. Here is the gasket surface, and it is scraped really clean. Again, I just have to wipe this down and it's good to go. Same thing on this side, nice and clean. Time to start wiping down the gasket mating surfaces. I'm just gonna spray with some brake cleaner. It says on the bottle, leaves no residue. So I'm spraying it on a rag first, and then I'm just gonna wipe down the surfaces. This will be the first pass. I'm gonna do multiple passes, but well, I've now made it to the fun part. And by fun, I mean slightly scary. And the reason why it's fun is because I'm now going to start putting everything back together and get my truck running again, hopefully. But the part that's scary is the fact that I have to do everything absolutely right here. And what I mean is the gasket mating surfaces on both the heads and the intake manifold have to be totally clean. This is one of those RTV areas I was talking about. And I'll just go ahead and wipe this nice and clean just to make sure that I'm getting all of the grease and oils. And you can see what I just was able to pull up from that. There's quite a bit of dirt and debris on there. So this is the stuff that you need to make sure, or I need to make sure that I'm cleaning off. I've got the intake manifold here upside down, and I'm just gonna do the same thing to this side. I'm just gonna rub down all these surfaces. And looking at the difference between the two gaskets, the new Felpro gaskets and the original factory gaskets, you can see that the Felpro gaskets really have some thickness to them. So it looks like they were made for exactly this situation where you may have slightly uneven surfaces from the process of removing old gaskets. And I think that's pretty cool because that means that if I did somehow mess up, you know, the perfectly machined surfaces here, hopefully those gaskets are going to take up any of those loose tolerances. Well, here I have all my bolts laid out on this kind of map of the intake manifold, and they're laid out in such a way that I will be able to put the exact bolt back in the exact hole. However, right now I need to clean off. You can see how dirty these bolts are. So I'm going to take this wire brush and go ahead and try to clean these up a little bit. And here is that same bolt after cleaning, and you can see just how much cleaner that is. That's a good thing. Okay, I'll start at the back here. Okay. Now I'm going to take some of my finger and just go around these water ports just a little. I'm going to go ahead and swap out gloves so I don't get RTV all over everything. Okay, now I'm going to take my gaskets. This one's for the driver's side. Set it in place. Just pressing the RTV into the corners a little bit. Okay, this is the passenger side. All the ports line up good. Here goes nothing. Here goes nothing. The tricky part is trying not to mess up the RTV and the gaskets. I think we're lowered. Okay, here's the front passenger bolt, which I'm just going to set in just to try to help locate everything. And here's the front driver. Okay, here's the rear driver. Okay. All right, I have all of the bolts just hand tight. You can see the brackets are in place on this front corner and that back corner. And now I'm going to go through with my torque wrench in a very specific sequence and tighten all of these down to 35 foot-pounds. The sequence, I'm going off of my Chilton manual, says this center section of bolts on the passenger side, the rear one is first. So I'm going to start here. And what I'm going to do is just kind of tighten them down. I'm not going to go all the way to 35 right now. I'm just going to kind of tighten them down in the sequence stated, and I will then come around and hit them at 35. Because we're dealing with a bunch of bolts here and we have centers and ends, I'm going to have to go around again, because when you go around like this in that sequence, what happens is some of these bolts might end up being a little looser because this aluminum material actually flexes as you tighten these down. So although these first ones were tight at 35 foot-pounds, they may have gotten loose with the flexing of this intake manifold. So I'm going to go around a second and possibly even a third time just to triple check. We'll see if this is still at 35. Had to turn it a little bit. I'm also going to go around one more time just because that's how I am. All right, and here is the second scary part of this job, and it's resetting the distributor and trying to get everything to line up the way you took it out. Well, if this was that easy, wow, I think we are perfectly lined up, and I can't believe it was that easy. That's insane. I'm looking at my marks down here at the base, and I'm also looking at my pencil marks I made for the rotor here where it started on this mark, and as I put it in and the gears grabbed, it twisted to this mark here. And with this intake manifold now set and all of the bolts torqued down to 35 foot-pounds, I went over them 3 times, and with that distributor set perfectly into place and the bolt torqued down, the only thing left to do is to put everything back together the same way we took it off. The entire thing is put back together. You can see everything is back the way it was, I hope. I also just changed the oil, brand new oil filter, 5 quarts of fresh synthetic oil. The reason why I did that is because when you take that intake manifold off, there is some antifreeze that dumps into the valley there in the engine, which ultimately runs down into the motor oil. So I wanted to get that changed. This way, when I start it up, it's just all fresh oil and hopefully no water. That being said, I'm about to start this thing up. I just have to hook up the negative side of the battery and then I can give it a start. However, I don't currently, which I thought I did, but I don't currently have enough antifreeze in the system. So I'm only gonna test it, make sure it starts, make sure that everything went back together correctly. I'll let it run for maybe just a minute or 2 to get some oil flowing, and then I'm gonna shut it down because, of course, I don't want it to overheat with not enough coolant in there. Here we go. Yeah! Woo! She's running! Woo! Feels nice and smooth too. We have oil pressure, that's good. Well, what'd you think? It wasn't easy. This was really my second time ever attempting intake manifold gaskets. The first time I ever did it was on the 03 Suburban you see behind me, but this one was a whole new animal. That 03 intake manifold was made out of plastic, and those gaskets were rubber and came right off. This one, on the other hand, that intake is aluminum, as you saw, and it was extremely difficult to get that gasket material off of not only that aluminum intake, but also the heads in the engine. And what was even more scary about that was the fact that as I'm taking all of that gasket material off, it's potentially falling inside of the engine. So I had to stuff the ports with blue shop towels to try to mitigate all of that debris getting down inside of the engine into where the valves are and everything. But I know inevitably there's going to be something that gets past me. Now, I did take my vacuum with a very skinny attachment and I shoved it in every one of those ports to try to vacuum out any debris that might have got past the shop towel or maybe fallen in when I was pulling the shop towel back out. And I ended up doing that multiple times, so let's hope that I was able to keep any debris from getting inside that engine. Not only was there the debris issue, but there was also the issue of keeping track of everything. As you can imagine, every single thing from the top of this engine, every sensor, every spark plug wire, cap and rotor, everything had to come off. And not only did it have to come off, but I had to know all the brackets and everything. I had to know where those things went back on and in what order. So I ended up grabbing a few sheets of paper, making a map of the intake manifold and mapping everything out. That way I knew where everything went back on. But I did have a couple of issues. There was a bracket in the very back that once I got everything back on, I'm like, oh no, where does this bracket go? And of course, one of the intake manifold bolts had to come back out after everything was already torqued down. Just had to do it. I couldn't take the entire thing apart and redo the whole job off of one bolt. So I just pulled that back bolt off, put that bracket in, bolted it back down, torqued it down, and hopefully everything's gonna be good. And the other scary thing is that RTV. You have to put your own gasket maker on the very front and the very back of the block. And I did my research on exactly how to do that, what type of RTV to use. Thankfully, the Feld Pro gasket kit that I had came with a little tube of gasket maker. It's the gray stuff. But when I initially purchased all of these parts and gaskets, I bought the Permatex Ultra Black thinking that's what I needed. And as it turns out, that's not the right product to use in this case. I'm sure the Ultra Black would have worked, but for some reason, the gray gasket maker is the stuff you want. Apparently, it's a little more dense and can fill these gaps a little bit better. Now, the other side of that coin is how much gasket maker do you put on there? I've seen people saying that you put a really thick bead on there, and then I've heard a lot of people talking about everyone always puts too much on there. And what happens is when you put too much and then you put the intake manifold on, a lot of that gasket maker goes back down, it blobs into the actual engine, which can of course damage the engine. And gosh, I didn't want to do that. So I think I put almost not enough gasket maker on there. We're gonna see how this works out, and I'm really really hoping that I just put enough. But if you look and see how much gasket maker I put on there, I read the directions, I did my research, and I thought that's what it was saying to do. A 5mm constant bead of gasket maker. I don't know if that was enough. Some of the research I did stated that when you put that manifold back on, you should just see that gasket maker coming out from the seam there. And I kind of don't see that. Though when I get down in there with my phone and try to look at that seam of gasket maker, I can see it blocking and covering the entire space there. The thing is these new Fel-Pro gaskets are thicker than the original factory gaskets. So you can see where I'm going with this. There's a lot of things you got to pay attention to. This is not a job for your average user. On the surface, it seems simple. Pull that intake manifold off and replace the gaskets. And maybe it is simple, but for me, trying to make sure I did the job exactly correct and didn't harm the engine in the process with debris and all that stuff, and trying to make sure that I put everything back on exactly where it should be, it wasn't easy. It took multiple days. I'm not gonna tell you how many days it took, but let's just say it was more than 3. Yeah, I know, roast me down in the comments below and tell me that you've done this exact job on this exact truck and it took you like 2 hours. Well, more could of course be said about this job. So if you have any questions, please comment below, and maybe me or somebody else who knows more than me will answer questions down there. But for today and this job, I think that'll do it. So thank you guys for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching One Road. If you're not a subscriber and you've watched this far, consider subscribing. You can also follow this channel on Instagram and Facebook. The handle is @OneRoadGarage. Well, I'm Jimmy for One Road, and I will see you in the next one.